in today's interview, I'm speaking to Steve Spencer, the managing director at Houlihan Lokey in their financial restructuring group. Steve, welcome, and thank you for speaking to us today.
Thank you.
Before we start, please give us a couple of minutes on your background and your role at Houlihan Lokey.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm a managing director at Houlihan Lokey. I've been doing financial restructuring for 25 years, the last 20 with Houlihan. Throughout that time, I've worked on a broad range of industries and companies. There aren't too many industries I haven't done deals in, and more recently, the most active industries for me have been travel, some technology restructuring, and in the consumer space. I've also restructured sovereign and municipal debt obligations. I continue to be active in the restructuring of Puerto Rico, for example. And I've testified as a restructuring expert before Congress, both branches, the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives.
Great. Thank you, Steve. So let's start. There are a lot of differences between this recession and the previous one, especially as we look at the impact of the Treasury and the Fed policies. So tell us how these policies are affecting this restructuring cycle. Sure.
So every restructuring cycle has its unique attributes, and this one is a multi-part drama. And I think some of the distinguishing aspects of this drama, the first act was really an unprecedented demand shock. The magnitude of the decline and the suddenness is really unprecedented, as I've said. I've been dealing with some companies that have seen negative comps in the mid 90s or high 90% range for months at a time. So the first act, with just the suddenness and the essentially total shutdown of certain segments of the economy is without precedent in the last few decades. The second act, I think, is the massive liquidity infusion, and this was driven by the Fed intervention, monetary policy, but that in turn led the private capital markets to open up in a fairly abrupt manner. And this allowed companies to borrow. That's not been the issue for many of the corporates that are in distress. But that really leads to the third act, which is a debate about the slope and the shape of the recovery. Is it going to be steep? In many segments of the economy, it has been a steep rebound. But the question is, will that be sustained? Which is kind of the fourth act. Now you've seen a bunch of companies, many corporates, load up on debt, and the question for these companies going forward will be twofold. One, did they borrow enough to sustain them through the duration of the recovery? In other words, if the slope is flatter, do they have enough liquidity to survive? And then once we ultimately get to the other side, whenever that is, there is a long-term question, a lingering question of solvency. Will these companies be able to service the debt obligations that they've undertaken to make it through this challenging period? And I guess there's really a fifth act here, and it's a big question mark, and it's political. Will DC finally support with thoughtful fiscal policy all of the significant monetary intervention? And so those are some of the really unique and distinguishing aspects of this particular restructuring cycle.
Interesting. I love the drama analogy. I think we will all be curious to hear how this fifth act evolved next year. So let's move on and talk about how the CLO market has changed the corporate restructuring dynamics.
Sure. It's a great question. And it's the CLO market has been around for a number of years, and it's become really over the last decade one of the most prominent features in one of the most prominent ways that many mid-market companies are funded. By mid-market, I look at companies that I would define as mid-market with 100 million to say, up to $2 billion of debt. And the CLO market has, as it's increased in prominence, it's been largely untested in terms of having weathered a restructuring cycle. So this is one of the first and most significant tests for these CLO participants and these CLO-dominated cap structures. So far, the funds have been able to adapt, and one of the things that makes a restructuring challenging for a particular CLO fund are the limitations that those funds impose on the ability to invest in, say, a debtor in possession, bankruptcy financing, or to take equity in a reorganized company. And so these artificial distinctions or separations that the funds impose and limitations on their ability to invest have implications with respect to their participation in restructuring. Again, so far, the CLO managers have been able to adapt, many of them, although there are still some that are struggling. And this has led to what one of my partners terms as lender-on-lender violence, where there are tensions that arise in these structures and that need to be mediated to get to a successful restructuring outcome. So that's something. It's not necessarily novel. These issues have arisen in the past, but as the CLO managers become more familiar with restructurings, it's something that I would expect we'll have to continue to attend to in future restructurings.
Great. So during these unprecedented times, what advice would you give to your clients when it comes to hiring advisors that can work together even in times of extreme stress or hard negotiation?
Sure. It's sort of blinding grasp of the obvious in some respects, but it's when, I'll take this from the company perspective. The bankruptcy community, there are a lot of overlapping relationships, and there are very few deals where I don't know many of the other professionals on the other side. It's a close-knit community. And I think it's important for people to try to understand at the outset the nature of these relationships. It wouldn't be uncommon, for example, for your financial advisor to have a good working relationship, a long-standing relationship with the counsel on the opposing side. Conversely, your counsel may have good relationships with the financial advisor. It's never going to be the case that your counsel is going to run the model for the company, or that your financial advisor will be drafting legal documents. But you do need to understand that they have a broad skill set, broad relationships, and I think it's reasonable for the client, the company in these circumstances, to not only try to understand these relationships and leverage those relationships. I think they really need to demand it, because every successful restructuring ultimately involves both sides rowing in the same direction at the end. And it's critical to try to leverage all these relationships in a way that creates that outcome.
Interesting. So I think in these times, we all have seen that relationships and communication, right, has evolved and changed in the in working from home, and really our skill set has also had to evolve in these times to stay ahead of the curve. So if you could think of 3 things that were instrumental to your success throughout your career and now, what would they be?
Sure. Another great question. I guess the first is try to avoid binary negotiating dynamics. And by that, I mean, try to avoid, for as long as possible, reducing it down to one negotiating variable where there's a yes or no outcome. So in lieu of that, what you should try to do is keep multiple variables at play and solve sets of problems that avoid that sort of blind alley where it's either yes or no outcome, and you have the potential to get stuck. So that'd be item number 1. Item number 2, don't jump to the end of a complex transaction. And very often as a restructuring professional, I can see at the outset the contours of the ultimate settlement. How does the company get beyond a very complex situation? But the parties, and this would include company management teams or boards of directors who aren't as experienced in restructurings, need to go through the steps. It can be tempting to jump to the end and to provide the solution. But again, the parties need to they need to be guided and assisted in that process. And you can't just let it happen. But if you jump to the end and you try to dictate, even in the interest of efficiency, however well-intentioned, that can be counterproductive in terms of, as a professional, as an advisory professional, isolating yourself or being perceived as overly aggressive. So guide, but the process, but let it happen at its own pace as well. And then the third is, many of the negotiations that I go through can be incredibly contentious. You start with a troubled situation, a company that's in severe financial distress, and the temperatures can rise in the heat of negotiation. For me, what's been important, particularly in that context, is to find I think of it as a circuit breaker. When tempers rise, when I see myself getting triggered by the behavior of somebody on the other side, find something that allows me to create some space, to not bite into what are an already emotionally charged situation, and use that space to think of a way to de-escalate, to take the temperature down and get back to a more productive, substantive negotiation. I always view that as a critical part of my role as a financial advisor in these troubled situations.
Thank you, Steve. I love this reference to the emotional circuit breaker. I believe these points that you highlighted are key for everyone that is an advisor. And in particular, during these days where all of us are dealing with so many new things and that are testing our resilience and patience. So Steve, thank you again for being with us and for sharing your point of view. I'm very grateful, and I'm looking forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I appreciate it. Likewise.